All right, everybody, this is Ebody and X from the Candid Frame again. And as part of our expansion in terms of the YouTube content, this is in a series of hangouts in which we talk about gear, but through the perspective of actual photography. What a novel concept. We're going to talk with photographers, talk about equipment, but see how that equipment, be it a camera, be it a lens, be it some sort of light modifier, whatever it is, makes a difference in their photographs. And they'll be showing us the photographs that they're making. We'll have an in-depth discussion in terms of how technology actually makes a difference in terms of the work that we're producing, rather than having this sort of you know relatively abstract discussion of gear and which one is better, blah blah, and so on and so forth, which is a conversation I am not interested in having. I've done enough of that in my lifetime, and I'm not getting any younger. So I want to spend time doing stuff that I actually enjoy and have fun. And with that in mind, I asked a great editorial portrait photographer, Bill Wadman, to join me. So some of you may know him from the show because I've had him on the show a couple of times. But he also has a podcast of his own on taking pictures that he co-hosts with Jeffrey Sidoris, another friend of the show. And Bill, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
For people who may have not heard the my show or your show, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do to keep yourself out of prison?
Yeah, sure. So my show that I do with Jeffrey is called On Taking Pictures. It's a weekly podcast. We've been doing, what, 5 years now? 5 years. Where we talk about more the creative process and why we take pictures and that kind of thing. And it's just the two of us chatting. So I've been doing that for 5 years, but since about 2007, I am a professional photographer. And I take pictures for magazines, and I do some commercial work, almost entirely portraiture. And it's funny, for me, taking pictures, I like doing the work for other people, but I also do a lot of work for myself. And a while back, I was thinking about buying a new camera that we're going to talk about today. And my agent said to me, you shouldn't buy it unless we're going to use it for this many times, for this many jobs and this kind of thing. And I said, yeah, but I want to use it for me. I want a camera, like I want a camera that I like. And so she's like, all right, well, go get what you want to get. Because for me, I like doing personal work, right? I like making things for myself, which leads me to making things for other people that is more interesting, right? I make better work for other people when I make better work for myself. So quick little thing, back in 2007, I started a daily portrait series, 365portraits.com, and I shot somebody different for a whole year in 2007, and that led to magazine work and all the rest of the stuff that I do until today. In fact, a little side note is that starting on January 1st of this year, last week, I started a new daily portrait series, which I'm doing on Instagram, which I haven't really told anybody about, but Wadman365 if you want to follow it, 9 days in. So a little bit of a marathon. It'll be fun.
Fantastic. I look forward to checking that out.
Yeah.
You were, for a long time, a Canon shooter. And
yes.
You recently switched over to the Pentax 645z.
Yep.
Tell me a little about your thinking in transitioning to that, because the Canon overall system has a camera that gives you 50 plus megapixels.
Yeah, there's the 5 DSLR, sure. Yep.
Yeah, so that may have been a consideration for at least some people, but why wasn't it for you? And why?
It was actually for a while. So I've been a Canon shooter forever. It's funny how you end up using the camera you use. For me, my father was a Canon shooter. He had a Canon AE1, which when he passed away about 10 years ago, I inherited, and it's sitting in the closet, and I hardly ever pull it out. But it's sitting in there. And because of that, I bought myself a Canon camera. My first like big boy camera. I had a Pentax K1000, the old manual.
Oh yeah,
yeah, absolutely. Sure. That was my first SLR in 2001. I bought a used K1000. And then a few years later, I went and bought a Canon film camera, an Elan 7, and started buying lenses. Moved to a Digital Rebel, moved to a 20D, moved to a 5D, 5D Mark II, 1DS Mark III. I had a 5D Mark III. So I moved through 5 or 6 different Canon bodies over the course of 12 years, and I had a lot of glass, right? You collect good glass. It lasts for a long time. In fact, up until a couple months ago, the last time I bought a lens was 7 years ago. I had a lot of Canon L primes. I would use the 35-1.4, the 50-1.2, the 85-1.2, and they're great. They're great glass, great, amazing stuff. But I do a lot of post-production to my images, and I bring in the raw files and I play with them. And a lot of times I'm doing serious curves in the shadows, trying to pull out detail and that kind of stuff, and masking it in different places. And I found myself frustrated by the fact that the dynamic range and the noise in shadows when you pull them up on my Canon 5D Mark III, it wasn't limiting in the fact that if that was the only camera that existed, I would live with it. But I was looking to upgrade because I've had the camera for a few years, and I was looking at the 5D SR that you were talking about. I looked at the new Canon 5D Mark IV, but I tried the 5D SR, and it's like, yeah, it's 50 megapixels, but they're kind of noisy when you pull up the shadows. The dynamic range isn't that great, It didn't give me any improvement other than resolution over what I already had. And I was playing with a friend of mine, is a Nikon guy, and has a D810, I guess it is. And he let me use it for a couple of shoots, and that's a Sony sensor as well, and just like my new Pentax. And I started playing with stuff, and I go, wow, these raw files are really malleable. I could do so much more with this, I'll show a few examples in a minute, but things that you thought weren't actually in there that you just open up in post, and it's all the information's there. And it allowed me to do things that I really wanted to do in my pictures, So when I was looking to upgrade, I thought, I don't carry my camera around. I'm not one of those guys who carries his camera everywhere I go. I would love to have a medium format camera, to have a little bit more, there's multiple things about it. There's the image quality issue, right? Bigger sensor, bigger photo sites, all the rest of it. And there's this sense of when you walk into a room and you're holding something that looks like this, subjects act different in front of a camera like this than they do in front of a Canon or a Nikon. It's weird, but it's true. And that has nothing to do with my ability to take pictures, but it does have something to do with the subject's attention that they give me, and the seriousness with which they take what we're doing. So there is a little bit of theatrics involved in it, which is amazing. But even so, putting that all aside, there's a 50 megapixel sensor in this thing that is the same sensor that's in the Phase 1 IQ 250. It's the same one that's in the Hasselblad, what is it, H550C or whatever the hell it is. Mm-hmm. Except this one costs $8,000 as opposed to $38,000. So bang for the buck, it's mind-blowingly great. The other cool thing about it is that these lenses, they've been making Pentax 645 lenses that are this mount, autofocus and manual and all the rest of it, since I think the mid-'80s. So there's a lot of glass on the used market. This lens new goes for about $2,500. I got mine on KEH for $340.
Oh, wow.
Right. So it's sort of like I replaced all of my really expensive Canon glass with $1,200 worth of lenses, and they're all amazingly good. So there's a lot. So there's something to it, right? It's a bang for the buck thing for me. It's like I want bigger, I want better, but I can't spend 40 grand.
I want to get back to something that you mentioned earlier in terms of being of the noise floor that you're experiencing with the cameras.
You want me to show you an example?
Well, before we do that, but it's kind of interesting because I think when most people have a discussion of ISO performance, they're talking about high ISO. Yep. And from what I've seen of your work, you're really working with low to moderate ISOs.
Most of the time, yeah.
So want to sort of explain that, because I think people may be surprised that, you're working with a low ISO. Why are you getting so much noise when the performance at high ISOs is supposed to be so good?
Right. Well, you're getting noise at low ISO mostly because on the Canon, my old camera, the sensor's dynamic range wasn't that great, and I was trying to shoot scenes that had a huge dynamic range in them. So the blacks and the whites would get pushed all the way to the ends. And if I tried to pull up the shadows, there wasn't a whole lot of information because it was all in the bottom stop and like the lowest significant bit in the digital file. So when you pulled it up, it was just there was a lot of noise in there. Not because that there was noise in the file visually when you saw it initially, but when you go in there and actually try to make those shadows more visible or more contrasty, the noise becomes far more visible. Now, you can do all kinds of things like, you know, shoot to the right and pull it down in post and do all kinds of tricks. And I did all of those. But there's times when you can't control the light as much as you want to control it. There's sometimes I use strobes and you're filling in the shadows to try to get them up into the area that you want them to be. But sometimes things are really contrasty, you know, and then you take the file home and you start playing with it, and it's not really what you want to do. There's also an element of this of the ability to sort of save your butt when things go wrong. I shot a picture. Here, I'll show you a quick shot here.
Okay.
I shot a picture of. Sorry, give me a second. All right, do you see that?
It'll take a minute for it
okay to show up. Yeah.
Okay, now we see it.
Okay, so where's the picture of my friend here? Okay, this is a picture of my buddy Cisco, and lots of lens flares and whatnot. You'll see this shot. You'll see if I can show you the 100% view. Here, let me go loop size large. Okay, so here's his eye, right? And you can see it looks pretty good. It's pretty sharp. It's, you know, that kind of thing. This shot initially looked like that.
Really? Oh,
yeah.
Geez.
Right. Which with my Canon camera would have been a mess if I pulled it up. And this thing, I go and I pop it up 4 stops. And even in the places down in his sweater and stuff down here, it looks pretty good, you know? So the ability to have all that information in there when it comes out of camera because something screwed up or the light didn't pop, but it's the perfect expression, it looks dead black. But all that information's in there. I just got to pull it up, you know.
Were you doing this shot primarily as a test to ascertain the?
This particular frame was honestly underexposed while I was just trying to get the exposure right. But it's a good example of the kind of thing that happens, you know.
But typically, you would try to remedy most of this by using a reflector or using a strobe.
Yeah, sure. In fact, yes. And in fact, I later pulled out a reflector. But still, that isn't always the exact same look. You know, that's the problem. But I mean, this is a pure example. But you know, let's show you another one. This is a panorama that I created in Monument Valley over in Arizona. Right. It's actually in Utah. I think it's on the line. One of the cool tricks about this is that you can actually take multiple. You ever use the Panorama Merging feature in Lightroom?
Once or twice.
Okay. So the neat thing about it is that it can, the final result that it pops out is actually still a DNG raw file, which you can then open up in this case, Capture One. So I could create this giant thing that I think is something like 16,000 pixels across or something ridiculous thing. And it looks like this. After a little bit of work in post, there's all this information in here. That's just sitting underneath all that other stuff, which and most of this is just playing with dynamic range sliders, right? Like the original looked like a lot like that. And just all the shadow detail is there, you know, and there's not a lot of noise in it. If I can just show that, say, it's like it's all just there. And just knowing that I can come home and I can start playing with my images and have them be malleable as, you know, this little guy of clay here is like a wonderful thing, because half my job is shooting and then half my job is making the thing that I want to make when I get home. I'm that kind of guy.
What percentage of images do you feel like you really are having to aggressively work with the file in that respect?
Well, when it comes to like more editorial stuff, not that aggressively, but for some of my more conceptual work, fairly often, or at least I could get results that I wanted from the Canon. I would be frustrated by them. I felt like my gear was a limiting factor in my vision. you know. And now with this guy, I feel like most of the time I'm not up to the camera's level, which is actually a good thing, right? Like I'll take pictures and I'll go, man, the camera did the job. I didn't do the job. I took the picture wrong. I lit it wrong. This light wasn't bright enough. This was too contrasty. This angle was wrong. The focus was off, that kind of thing, you know. And of course you notice all those things when you've got 51 megapixels and a whole lot of dynamic range and, you know, the whole nine. So it's not every shot, but it's just knowing that you have a tool that can do anything that your mind can think of and you're not limited by your tool. That is very refreshing to me.
Yeah. How about color fidelity? Because people talk about
Sure.
noise when you're trying to open up the shadows, but you know, when you underexpose something, it affects the way you perceive the color and the way the color is rendered.
Yep.
How is that different compared to what you were using before?
You know, I would get a lot of color banding and noise on the old camera. Like, so the color fidelity actually changed more in the highlights. If you're pulling back highlights, a lot of times you'll lose a lot of color information. In the shadows, it was less of a problem. And you could always go in there and tint them and do curves to try to get them sit more correct, you know. Yeah, it was less of a problem in shadows than it was in highlights for me. But I don't have that problem as much anymore. I mean, you just saw that picture of Cisco. I mean, obviously, it was that particular shot was taken at right into the sun at golden hour. You know what I mean? So it's very yellow. But that's just an element of it. The funny thing is that I've actually switched to using Lightroom, which I was a very, very serious Lightroom advocate. I'm a big Lightroom fan. To using Capture One with this camera, and there's a real weird reason for that. The files in Lightroom, they look okay, they look good, and you can get them where you want them to go. But the profiles, the color profiles in Lightroom for the Pentax aren't that great. And the problem is that the Capture One won't read the DNG files that come out of this camera because Phase One doesn't want competition. It actually locked them out. They used to work in Capture One 8, but they stopped working in Capture One 9.
Really?
Yeah. Oh. Yeah. However, here's the great thing. This is really tricky. There's a command line tool called EXIF tool. You ever hear of that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's open source, you know, thing that can go in and modify EXIF data. So you install that, and then I've made a little automator script. So when I copy stuff over, it renames it how I want, and it changes the camera make from Pentax to Phase One and model from 645z to IQ 250, and the files open perfectly fine in Capture One. And it uses the Capture One profiles for the IQ 250, which is the same sensor, so they look amazing. Okay. So skin tones and that kind of thing, just much easier to get right now than they were before for me.
Had you had experience with the Phase One system?
I've shot with Phase One, yeah, and I've shot with the Hasselblad stuff.
So this, you know, other than the you know, the big huge gap in price,
sure,
in terms of the performance that you're seeing in terms of noise and color fidelity, what any differences are you seeing?
No, they're equivalent. As far as I'm concerned, they're identical. Yeah. But you know, it's funny though, because there are advantages to this guy over the other ones. There was a video I saw the other day of a guy who took this camera with one of the new lenses that is weather sealed to the beach. He stuck it on the sand. He poured sand over the top of it. He picked it up. He shook it off. He went over to the shower, turned it on, ran the thing under the shower, and then started taking pictures. It's like, try that with your IQ, you know, with your Phase One body and back, and see how far you get. Battery life. I went on a trip for 9 days out west where I took that picture of Monument Valley. I didn't take that many pictures. I'm not a guy who takes a ton of pictures when I'm traveling, but I took 300 pictures. And when I came back, I brought 2 full batteries. The first battery still said it was full in the camera.
Oh, that's good.
For a medium format camera, that's insane. You know, it does 3 frames a second, which is crazy for a medium format camera. So it shoots like a digital SLR, like a smaller camera. It's just got a big honking sensor inside of it, which is exactly what I wanted, you know.
How has it changed the way that you shoot? I mean, you mentioned the fact that the presence of the camera can influence your
Sure.
your portrait subjects in terms of how they respond to the camera and to you. But
Sure.
what are some of the practical changes that you've had to make, like with respect to lighting?
I am honestly, one of the big things is the fact that I feel less hamstrung by having my lighting, worrying about the fact that I need to get things leveled as much as possible at the shoot, which I love to do when I can, but when in doubt, I'd rather get the moment with the person rather than the lighting perfect. Here, let me show you a shot I took the other day from here. Let's go back to this, and come here, camera. There we go. Here's a picture of this is a picture I took at a diner near me recently, and this is you see that?
Yeah.
Okay. Don't worry, she's got pasties on. She's not nude. I wanted to do this diner shot. Now this is 7 lights, I think. I had a light up front, just filling a little bit. I had 2 speed lights, one in the refrigerator over on the left, one in front right off the camera left to fill the front of these guys' faces. There's one light up in the corner backlighting her. There's one light kind of as a spotlight on her. And then there's the one you can see off to the right that's sort of rim lighting the guy in the front. But when I was done with this shot, it ended up looking like, let's see if this pulls this up. Sorry, it's very, very slow. There you go. All right, you see the new version?
Oh, yeah.
So this is what I did with the image when I was done with it, right? And big difference, obviously, right? A lot of more contrast, color correction, darkened a whole bunch of stuff, cleaned up, removed some stuff, the usual stuff that you do in big shots like this. But I knew that when I left the shoot, and especially when you have like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people in the shot, plus I had a couple of people helping me out with the shoot, plus me, and we're all there at midnight at some diner in Brooklyn. It's nice to know that when you leave, you didn't waste everyone's time, that you have what you need. By looking at the back of the camera, I can look at the histogram. I know that I'm locked in close enough, and I know that even though the waitress on the left is wearing all black, in the initial shot, if I go back to it, that just looks like one big black thing. Now, would I have loved to have another fill thing on her? Sure, but I'd already gone through 7 lights and didn't have any more on me.
Yeah, I was going to ask to look at that previous shot. To look
yeah,
at the
but see, if I pump up the exposure on this shot, you see there's all kinds of information in her shirt and in the stuff. Which when I do the final one, I can play with some curves and stuff, and you get is it going over there? Yeah, I get just enough information over there that I get what I need. So this kind of stuff happens all the time. And then there is the case of the resolution. So I shoot a lot for magazines. Magazines are rarely, if ever, 2x3, right? You're throwing away pixels most of the time, just because of the way things work. You're cutting the top and the bottom off it if you're shooting portrait. You're cutting the sides off if you're shooting landscape. And I found myself going to more of a 4x5. This sensor is a 3x4 ratio. I found myself going to more of a 4x5 crop all the time anyway. So, a 4x5 crop from this camera is not that far. It's that much, which is pretty close to what I already have. And you get resolution where, when it's sharp, there's the girl's eye, all the way down to like hairs around her eye. And I'm pretty far away, So I was working on I did a magazine cover recently, and I took a picture of this guy, the new guy who's playing Hamilton in Hamilton.
Okay. Yeah.
And I took a wide-angled shot of him, and I wasn't even using this camera. I was actually using my friend's Nikon that day, the V810. And I took a picture of him. It was slightly wide-angle, sort of thighs up kind of thing, like top of his legs up. And the magazine came back, and they wanted to crop tight to his face for the cover. And I had just barely enough pixels to pull that off with a little bit of sharpening and all the rest of it. With my Canon, had I been using it, I would have been stuffed. I would not have been able to have the resolution that I needed to do that. So, it's not always my creative idea. It's also my clients want to take something and they want to turn it into something else. They want to crop tight. They want to brighten this up. They want to pull that back. Having that ability and that freedom is a good thing.
And that's not an unusual request from the editorial world.
No, not at all. And I will tell you, the just overall having this many pixels, you get into this range, this sort of curve up top where you have enough pixels where it feels sort of analog all the time. You take a picture, you zoom in, and there's not really any jaggies. It's like you don't actually ever see any pixels unless you go into 400%, and even then, it doesn't have the same screen door feel that lower res files would have. Now, is this always necessary? Absolutely not. Do you need that many pixels to fill a 8.5 by 11 magazine? Of course not. Mm-hmm. But having the freedom to crop, to change things up, to print. Sometimes I print 30 by 45, big prints. Being able to print the stuff that I want that big and having it look good that big without having to fight and up-res and do all kinds of stuff is very exciting for me. Yeah.
Let's talk a little about you using Capture One, because you mentioned why you used it, but that's sort of like another consideration that you have to make sometimes when you change camera systems.
Yep.
Because as much as you may like Lightroom or Photoshop or Capture One, sometimes it's inevitable that you find that there's another application that does a better job at processing the file.
Yeah, and I didn't find that with my Canon files. I had played with Capture One a few times with my Canon files because people said, "Oh, it's so amazing," and this, that, and the other thing, and the color fidelity and the skin tones and all this kind of stuff. And when it came to my Canon 5D files, I didn't really agree with that all that much. And I've tried it a few times, and I would play with it, and I'd say, okay, yeah, it's fine. I could use this if somebody made me use this. If I wanted to shoot tethered in a shoot, yeah, this would work great, I guess, but it never really drew me in. Even with the Nikon files, which had a Sony sensor, it didn't really draw me in. Only with this camera have I noticed a big difference. And I don't think it's an inherent limitation of Lightroom. I think it's just the level of care that they've taken in creating color profiles for a camera that, frankly, isn't that popular, right? How many 5Ds and 810s are they going to sell, Nikon and Canon? Mm-hmm. Millions. Maybe there's 5,000 of this camera around. Who knows? I don't blame them, which is why it's kind of neat that I get to use the IQ250 profiles because, well, they match the sensor anyway, so it's kind of already there. Phase One did the work for themselves. I'm just sort of piggybacking on top of it.
And some people will create their own custom profiles, but
sure,
is that of no interest to you?
I've done it actually. I tried doing it in Lightroom. Well, I did. I successfully did it, but they still didn't look as good as the Phase One ones for some reason. Color checkers, different lights, sources. I did the whole thing. It was better, but it wasn't great. There's tools, there's things inside of Capture One that I really like. I like sort of the output recipes and just processing things to export different sizes and stuff all in one fell swoop. I like the crop tool. I like the doing sort of adjustment layers inside of there. The black and white tool isn't quite as good. I don't like the highlight and the shadow sliders as much as I do inside of Lightroom, but I'm coming to terms with the fact that this is my world now, and there are advantages and there are disadvantages.
What's the default ISO? Is it 50 or 100 on that?
100 on this, yeah.
So what's the range that you typically use, and what do you think its tolerance as far as your work is concerned?
Well, yeah, that's actually interesting too. Let me share another picture here because this is a good one. The other day, so I started this new series, and I took this picture here of a woman named Dory Kagan, who's a painter. Let me pull up the finished one. That's the original raw file. Okay, there's the finished one. And I went over and I shot her in her studio, and there was light coming in from the right, as you can see from the windows, but it wasn't enough to really light her. And I was late to get to this shoot. I'm going to admit that I'm a failure. I was late to get to this shoot, which I rarely ever am, but I was rushing, and I picked up my little Einstein and a little stand and a soft lighter, and I ran out the door and I ran down the street to where her studio is. And I got there and I opened up the bags and I realized that I hadn't put a power cable in the bag with the Einstein, which honestly I don't think I've ever done before, and will probably never do ever again. But I did this day. And the one thing that she had there was a little clip-on light, which had the wrong white balance. It was a tungsten clip-on light, which here, let me go to the original. See, this is the original raw file. Did that one show up, right? You see it's a little, so the background's blue because it's daylight, and she's sort of a little yellow, warm because she's getting hit by the tungsten. But there wasn't a whole lot of light. And I was shooting, if you can see down in the corner, I was shooting 125th of a second at f5 on a 35 millimeter lens, which is the equivalent of like a 28 on full frame on this camera. And I'm shooting at 1600 ISO. And I shot her at 1600 ISO, and I would shoot at 1600 on my Canon if I had to. I didn't really want to, but if I had to, it was fine. This camera at 1600 ISO, if I can get the full version here. Is this about to crash on me? Doesn't like that at all. Okay, there we go. Hold on a second. It's gonna grab the big one. Is pretty great. There you go. That's 1600 ISO and with no noise reduction. So it is nearly flawless at 1600, which is amazing to me because my Canon wouldn't be this good. It would be fine, but it wouldn't be quite this good. So I find myself shooting at higher ISOs now, or in the past few weeks. I've only had this camera for a couple months. But I'm feeling safer shooting at 1600, shooting at 800, shooting at 3200 even, and knowing that the files are still going to be great. They're going to be good, and they're still malleable. Because a lot of times, yeah, you could shoot at 3200 or 6400 with a Canon or Nikon camera, but you're not going to want to mess with those raw files too much. Pulling up the shadows and stuff, because they're not going to breathe, and these do. So it's pretty nice. So yeah, I find myself shooting higher ISOs than I normally would. Although if I have lights, I stick with 100, 200, 400. The old standbys. I'm old school. Like I started shooting when you couldn't shoot higher than 400 without it looking kind of crappy.
Yeah, that's true.
And so now you start using these cameras go to 204,000. And it still looks pretty good. It's kind of like, wait a minute, you kids today are cheating.
You're dating yourself, Bill, by admitting that. Be careful. Well, transition in any, like upgrading to a camera usually involves some sort of, time to adjust. But when you're changing to a completely different system, it involves a whole bunch of different sort of complications and considerations.
Sure.
Tell me about transitioning to using this and getting to the point that you're comfortable, because when you're on assignment, there's not a lot room for error when it comes to that.
Right. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's actually been an element of starting the new daily project, is just because it forces me to shoot with this thing all the time. So I'll figure out the nooks and crannies that frustrate me or bother me or drive me crazy. And there are a few little things, like with any camera, nothing's perfect, right? I don't like the shutter of this camera sounds. Isn't that weird? You know how you have like there's certain like there's elements of all this stuff that just seems somewhat ridiculous. It's fine, but it feels a little floppy. Not quite as tight as I like.
I couldn't give you the nice clunk of the old 645.
Well, that's exactly it, right? And part of it actually is because the predecessor of this camera was the 645D, I think it was called. Which was a 40 megapixel CCD sensor, where this one's CMOS. And some people complained because at certain shutter speeds, there would be camera shake from the mirror. And so they actually dampened this mirror and shutter a little more on this one, which solves that problem, but makes it feel a little bit mushier, than I personally would like if I had my druthers. There's also the idea of like what focal lengths you like to use and what lenses match up with the focal lengths that you're used to shooting with your old camera. I was always a prime guy. I owned one zoom. All the rest of my lenses were primes, and I never used the zoom. With this camera, my main lens is actually a zoom. It's this 24 to 80, or I'm sorry, 45 to 85, which is like a 35 to 65 in 35 millimeter land. So, kind of a 24 to 70 kind of thing, but a little tighter in the ends. And it's f4.5. It's not a fast lens, The fastest lens I own actually for this camera is a 3.5. It's a old manual lens. It's a 150 millimeter f3.5 auto aperture but manual focus lens. Let me tell you something. When you're 42 years old, like I just turned the other day, trying to manually focus a camera that's 50 megapixels by hand is tough.
Welcome to my world, brother.
Right? But this lens was 130 bucks. You know, so it's like, how can you go wrong? It's super sharp. It's great. I took a picture with it the other day. The first picture I took with it the other day that I actually really like, because I never shoot with long lenses. I'm a portrait photographer who prefers wide-angle lenses. You know, I'm this strange anachronistic beast over here.
But you're doing like environmental portrait. That's why you're sort of leaning.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So whenever I shoot with a longer lens, everything just feels like a cheesy headshot to me. So I'm trying to overcome this bias that I have. So it's the other thing about it is that it's pretty heavy. It's about the weight of like a 1D, which, you know, or a D3 in the Nikon world, you know, D5, which means it's, I think, about 4.5 pounds, something like that, without a lens. So it's not a light camera, but again, I don't carry mine around, so that's not an issue. You know, I'm not one of those guys who has it in his bag on his shoulder all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
With respect to the lenses, are you noticing any difference between the older film lenses and the more recent ones? Because, you know, with film, there was a lot more tolerance that you had.
Yeah, it's interesting. So the two lenses that I have, I have three lenses. The three lenses that I have, two of which are autofocus, and I'm still building my lens kit for this camera, are both, when I get the settings right, like if I'm, you know, even wide open at f4.5, this zoom, if I get the focus right, is tack sharp. I mean, just frighteningly sharp in the middle. So the whole idea of film lenses versus digital lenses, you know, there's lots of people who talk about that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. These were made for 645 film, right? They were made for high res, medium format bodies back in the day. And, you know, there's something about bigger formats, the lenses for them don't have to shrink the image as much. And it's a strange, like, intuitive thing, but and I look, I'm not an optical engineer. I'm not going to sit here and tell you what, how, or why, but there's a feeling that I have whenever I shoot with medium format or even large format, because I shoot 4x5 sometimes, that the less work the lens has to do, the better the image quality is. You know, so if you're trying to reduce the world down to a little tiny thing that's the size of your pinky fingernail versus down to the size of something that's that big, you know, I have no problems with any of these lenses so far. In fact, the wide angle lens that I use on that shot with the girl up, the burlesque shot, I shot with this 35 prime, and I was just doing some research, as you do when you get into this stuff. And there was some guy from a few years ago who shot with this, the 40 millimeter Hasselblad and the 35 millimeter Schneider for the phase 1, and did all kinds of, you know, crazy optical tests. And this one actually came out on top of both the other ones. So these lenses are top notch when you get the top notch ones, you know. So no, I haven't had any problems personally. One strange thing about them is that they manually focus, right? And to autofocus, there's a clutch. You go like that, and it autofocuses, which is a thing that I had never seen before. You know, it actually slides forward the focus ring to go to autofocus. Very odd. Sorry, you were saying.
But you still have your 35 millimeter, or you have just completely
sold it. Sold it 2
okay,
weeks
so
ago.
tell me about finally
selling everything.
Yeah, because that can always sort of be a difficult thing, because I know it took me a while to finally sell all my Canon gear.
Emotionally,
just get rid of it.
or financially, or technically, or, like, you know, the process of selling.
Yeah.
Yeah. I sold a bunch of L primes. I sold my body. I still have a 51.4, a 28.18, and a 40 millimeter pancake that I still have to sell. You know what it was? Once I got this, it's like when you get a new car, and at first you're just like, oh, but my old car. Well, I can't actually say this. I've never owned a car, but you know, you get the new one, and at first you feel like you're cheating on your old car, you know, right? And then, you know, a week in, you go, yeah, that old car kind of sucks compared to this new one. Why do I feel this way? It's just a box. It's just a tool, you know? I ended up selling the body and most of the 3 of the lenses on eBay. I sold 2 of the lenses one on Craigslist and 1 to a friend who wanted that specific one. Most of the reason I did that is that to pay for this, you know, because this is not an inexpensive purchase. Mm-hmm. And so in order to financially do it and to, you know, make my wife not hate me forever, I had to find a way to justify it. And the way I justified it was, look, got to spend money for tax reasons, and I'm going to sell the old one, you know? And I did, and selling the old body and all the old lenses paid for this body. And like I said, I spent about $1,000 on these lenses. So I'm still, you know, so I basically spent $1,000 to upgrade, which in the grand scheme of things isn't too bad.
Yeah. You know? So what are the lenses that you have? You mentioned the initial zoom that you're using.
Yeah, I've got the 45 to 85 zoom. It's an f4.5. I've got a 35 f3.5 prime, which is sort of a wide angle. It's like a 28. And I've always been a fan of the 28 millimeter feel on like a 35 millimeter camera. The problem is that the ratio is different, right? So it's sort of the same width as a 28, except a little bit higher because it's a 4:3 ratio. Mm-hmm. And then I have this 150 manual lens. In the future, I'm going to buy the 100, I think it's a 120 macro f4, which is apparently a beautiful, beautiful lens. You know, there's certain lenses for certain size sensors that is just sort of optically easy, right? Like on a 35 millimeter, it's a 50 prime, right? Everybody's 50 prime, whether it's Pentax or Fuji or whoever else. That's an easy lens to make. It's great. It looks great. Every single one of them looks great. Even the $100 plastic ones with the plastic mount look, you know, have great image quality. On this camera, apparently a 120 macro is really easy, and like a 75 prime. I bought a 75 prime, a used one, and there was something wrong with it, and I brought it back, and I'm going to get another one of those pretty soon. So okay. Yeah, so, small kit though.
So when you go on assignment, what's your backup?
At the moment, nothing. Yeah.
You're a brave soul.
You know what? Here's the thing. I rarely, if ever, brought a backup when I was shooting Canon. I've never had my cameras fail me to the point where I couldn't do my job. What I was thinking of doing, actually, I've been going back and forth on this. What I'm thinking of doing is buying a Fuji X100T used, especially when the new ones come out.
Yeah.
And just having that in the back is a nice little tiny thing, and bring that along. I had an X100S for a while that I liked a lot, but I just couldn't justify carrying it or, you know, keeping it around because I didn't use it enough. But that's the idea. Yeah, something like that. Why do you think I'm crazy for not having a backup?
I was just curious because you just said how much money you spent on this system, and it's like, okay, he's now got another $8,000 somewhere.
Well, it's funny that my friend Dan Gottesman said to me the other day, he goes, "Oh, he's like," I said, "I really love this camera, Dan." He's like, "That's really great. You should buy another body as a backup." I was like, "Do you have another $8,000 sitting around in cash that you have nothing to do with? Like that's just gonna sit there most of the time?" Like I don't, you know.
Yeah, my X100S has been my backup.
Yeah. Well, you know, what's funny is that like I said, I kept that 100 or the 50 and the 28 prime Canon primes. I could buy a, you know, whatever. What's the Rebel XTI or, you know, X3T, you know, whatever
it is, yeah.
Whatever, you know, the nice little 18 or 24 megapixel crop sensor Canon that weighs nothing. That's tiny. Like I don't need it to do anything fancy. You know, put the 28 on that acts like a 45 or a 50, you know, something like that. I could shoot an assignment with that if I had to, you know. So there's part of me, and you can get those for $300 used, you know.
Yeah, I'm way past the idea of having to buy two $2,500 or $3,000 cameras just to have one as a backup that's exactly the same as my main body.
Yeah, a friend of mine has those Profoto B2 lights, you know, the little pack and heads. And he's got 2 packs and 4 heads. He's got like 2 full, you know, pack and 2 head kits, and he brings them both with them. And I said, you know, he's like, well, you got to have a backup. And I said, you spent $3,000 on a single set of lights. You had to buy a whole other $3,000 set because you don't trust it. You know, for $3,000, you should trust that they work 99.9% of the time. And that's kind of how I feel about this guy, where it's like, you know what, maybe it will fail one day. And on days when, if I'm going to use it, if I get a big commercial job, I haven't in the last month and a half that 2 months that I've had it. If I do that, okay, well, I'll rent another one. Lensrentals.com rents them for a week. It's $600, $700. If that's in the budget, sure, rent another one just to have it there. Just in case. The nice thing about it is that the lenses are so cheap that, let's say I go to some shoot and I need some longer lens. Say I need that macro for some random thing that I want to do. I can spend $600 on the macro instead of spending $1,000 renting a Hasselblad in a macro. For $500, I can buy the macro. I already own the body. You know what I mean? Like, so I can collect as part of doing jobs, save the money of the rentals, and actually buy gear instead.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, you're talking about your latest 365 project, and you started initially with one several years back.
Sure.
You were using, I think, the 5D Mark I or Mark II for that?
That would be the 5D Mark I.
Mark I, okay.
2007.
So now that you're doing another project, can you talk about what the experience like is shooting it now, considering not only what you're using now, but what you've learned in the intervening years?
I'm a slightly better photographer than I was 10 years ago. I've noticed that, right? Less clunkers, at least in the beginning of this project, than I was experiencing 10 years ago today. Yeah, it's funny. I like owning this stuff so I can do my own work. So for me, the experience of shooting these projects is the same as me shooting that burlesque thing at the diner. It's going out and trying to make something different that I wouldn't have made before. And that's honestly the reason why I upgraded, is because I wanted to start making pictures that, look, you have a style, I have a style, everybody's got a style, their look of their pictures. And I don't expect my pictures to change the way they look. I want them to be that with a polished sheen on top, right? I want that plus. Mm-hmm. And so going out there with this camera, it's like, okay, well, let's start trying to find new angles, new looks, limitations, super bright contrasty days outside where I don't blow out the sky because the sensor has 14 stops of dynamic range, So it's fun trying to push myself by pushing my gear to make better pictures, or pictures that are more in line with the kind of pictures I want to be making, which hopefully will, lead to clients saying, "Oh, that's really interesting, that different thing that you made," and you go, "Okay, yes, let's do some work together," So it's the same and different all in one, just a fancier camera and much bigger files. I'll tell you, that's one of the things. I have to work off an SSD now. I can't work off of spinning drives.
So how big are the files typically that you work with out of this thing?
Well, it's funny, when I do a lot of work in post, I will oftentimes hit the 4 gigabyte TIFF limit. I do that all the time, where it says, "Sorry, your file is too big to save."
Did you have to upgrade your computer, or are you just working with the existing one?
I bought a 750 gig SSD that I use as like a work slate now, and then I moved that stuff off to a loaded up Drobo. USB 3 Drobo, which does like 200 megs a second, which is pretty good. And then all of that gets backed up to Backblaze. So, but these raw files are 60, 61, 62 megs a piece.
Which is another consideration that
yeah. I find myself deleting a lot more stuff now. I will, if I took 100 pictures of you today, I would cull it down to 40 or 50 on the first cut, and the other 50 get deleted, gone. If it doesn't make 1 star, it's like I don't have room for it on the drive. Because how often are you going back to something where the guy's eyes were closed, or you know what I mean? Like, you're not going back to that stuff. And if there's one interesting shot where the lights went off while you were doing a test and the guy was making a goofy face, all right, we'll just give that 1 star and keep it around, But yeah, I've started really culling down and keeping less. Than I was before. So yeah, I've got 32 gigs of RAM. I've got an SSD that I work off of, the whole 9. But and that stuff helps. But it is a slightly slower process, certainly slower than it was back on a 12 megapixel 5D.
What are you working with memory cards, or is there specific cards that you need to have in order for it to work optimally?
Not crazy. These are, I don't know, SanDisk Extreme Pro 64 gig cards. So 95 megs a second. Say again?
Yeah, what was the data transfer rate on those?
Oh, 95 megs a second.
Okay.
So they're fast cards, but not like explosively fast cards. The nice thing about this camera, it's got 2 SD card slots, and so I load it up with identical cards, and I have it write the same thing to both cards. So if one card gets corrupt, everything's on the other card. You can put a flu card. It's kind of like a what's the Wi-Fi ones that little SD Wi-Fi cards?
Yeah.
iFi.
iFi,
yeah,
right.
Yeah. So they make a sort of proprietary iFi card that's like $100 that you can then connect your phone. You can browse and actually control focus and take pictures and that kind of stuff. I don't really need that stuff, but that is an option as well.
And tethering isn't an option with this camera, right?
Tethering is an option.
Okay.
They made a Lightroom plugin that tethers. In fact, I did a 4-day commercial shoot a couple months ago with a rented version of this camera, and we plugged it into Lightroom and a laptop, and it worked fine. I mean, I don't shoot tethered that often, so if you're a guy who shoots tethered all the time, and you really want to tether to capture one, well, you're gonna have to buy a phase body. But for me, for my purposes, I'm fine tethering to Lightroom if on the occasions that I need to do it. You know?
And you find that the screen that's on the back of the camera is sufficient to be able to sort of assess what's happening as you're shooting?
Yeah, the nice thing about the screen on the back of the camera too is that you can actually, if I can show you if I can pull a picture up. So here's a picture I took today. I know that's super bright and terrible, but I made it so that when you click one click forward, it actually goes straight to 100%. Okay. So I can go in and check and see, see what's going on, like if the zipper's in focus in this case, right? The screen is good. Actually, I did one other little experiment where I actually plugged a HDMI monitor into the HDMI port on the side, and used that as a big version of the screen, and it worked great actually. So as sort of a poor man's tether, just to be able to see it bigger and to get a good look, it outputted a 1080p signal, and I zoomed into 100%, and it was pow! It was big on a 17-inch screen. So that's nice. Definitely another option to do if you don't want to bring a laptop. I don't even own a laptop, so I'm not, I'm like 2 steps behind. Well, I can't edit on a laptop. I need more juice than that. So I just never got around to buying one. My wife's got one that I use occasionally. But,
is there anything about the 35 millimeter, DSLR system that you sometimes miss when you're using this?
There are times when this camera's big, but again, I see that as a positive, not as a negative. There's lots of people who think a 5D is huge and they want to use a XT1 or 2, right? And there's people who think those things are huge and want to use a RX100 Mark V. So for me, I don't mind the bigness of it. I have a friend who is a photographer who's been around for 50 years, and I brought it over to his house, and he's a serious heavy. He used to shoot with Rolly 6060s, like old school Rolly.
Oh yeah.
And he shot Time Man of the Year covers and stuff. And he picked up this camera, and he's just like, "That thing's heavy. How the hell do you carry that around?" I was like, "You carried around two giant Rollies for years. Like, what are you complaining about this?" He's like, "Oh, But he's shooting with a 5D now. He thinks that that's fine. And for people who they think that's fine and it does what they want it to do, more power to you. Same thing with the Fujis. They put out a great file. It's just that I wouldn't want to print one of those gigantic on the wall. I wouldn't want to so it's all the right tool for the right job. This isn't the right tool for everybody, but so far in the last 2 months, it's the right tool for me, and that's kind of nice.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of the whole. That's why I was really looking forward to having a chance to speak with you, because I think this conversation is kind of showing what I'm hoping that this series ends up being, is sort of is having that understanding that there's not one particular perfect camera that sits on Odin's lap. That it's really
as much as the manufacturers want you to think that, right? And and it's like, look, I've played with the Fujis, I played with the Olympus, I played with Panasonics, I played with Nikons, I played with I chose Canons. They're great, but if Canon made this camera, I would have bought the Canon version of it just from, I guess, some weird brand loyalty. But it's Pentax, and and it's like, it's great, they've done a really good job, and in some ways, I want to reward them for creating a camera that is 1/5 the price of its competitors, but has the same level of performance. Yeah. Even there are some horror stories about getting these things fixed, which I'm a little concerned about, in the sense that you have to send them off, and it can take like 6 weeks to get them back in some weird instances and stuff. But I'm hoping the hardiness of this thing means that I will never have to actually send it in. So, we'll see. And in that case, I'll just go buy a $400 Canon and use that for a few weeks, while I get this thing fixed.
And the wonderful thing now is that you can rent stuff now so easily.
Yep.
That should something have to go in for service,
especially in New York. Like if I really need a camera, I can get a camera in 2 hours. Actually, quick little story. I was down in DC. My sister was in the hospital for unrelated things, and I had to run down to DC. And I was in DC, and I had a shoot for a magazine of a guy who was coming up from DC to New York in a few days. And he emailed me, he said, I have to cancel. I'm not coming up. It turns out my meeting got canceled. And I said, well, it's funny. I'm actually in DC right now if you want to meet up. And I didn't have a camera. So I put out a call on Twitter, and I said, hey, I'm in DC. I need to do a shoot. Anybody got a camera? And a listener of OTP came down with a D800, and I shot the thing. I pulled the card out, or actually he Dropboxed me the files in a couple hours, and I sent them to the magazine, and everything was fine. But nowadays there's cameras everywhere. It's like you're not gonna be screwed if you don't have a camera on you at all times. Or
it's just a tweet away.
Hey, look, there are professional photographers, like high-end guys, who don't own a camera. They just rent every time they need it because they're shooting with a Hasselblad or a Phase or whatever it is, which is cool. I wouldn't want to pay that much money either, for something that's going to be upgraded and changed.
Oh yeah, especially when you start getting up there, right?
But this is like this weird level where it wasn't that much more than an upgrade on my Canon would have been, and it's like, well, take the leap, start making the kind of pictures you want to make, and if this is a tool you think you need or that can explore your vision better, then life is short, man. You can't take it with you.
Yeah.
And I'm not a guy who buys a lot of gear. So yeah.
Well, Bill, thanks for joining us. I really enjoyed having a chance to talk with you. Tell us where we could go to find out more about your work, especially your latest series.
You can, let's see, BillWadman.com, WADMAN. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Bill Wadman. And my new project is Wadman365 on Instagram right now. So you can go check that out. I haven't actually told anybody about it. So at the moment, I think I have 60-something followers, but I think I'm going to open it up in the next few days and try to get a little press for it. So we'll see. Cool. But yeah, that was a lot of fun.
And for people who just found this YouTube channel from just doing a search and never heard of the Candid Frame is actually a podcast in which I feature conversations with some of the world's best photographers. I've been doing it for 11 years, and you can go to thecandidframe.com and listen to over 340 conversations with some great photographers, including Bill here. And there's a free app available for all three, Windows, Android, and Apple, that you can download for free, which will give you access to the entire archive of interviews. So check that out. And thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.